Hello and welcome. In previous videos we have looked at London Transport and how they tried desperately to go one-man operated. But in this episode we're going to move north to another city to see how it happened there and how ultimately it became much more successful than London. Grab your coat, jump in the Quattro, we're going all the way back to 1958 and to Manchester. Manchester Corporation was the predecessor of Selneck Pte, which itself was the predecessor of Greater Manchester Pte. Now, in the days that we're going back to, PTEs weren't even a grin on their dad's face. The history of Manchester Corporation Transport Department goes all the way back, really, to 1824, and this was when the first horse bus service was started by John Greenwood. On the 1st of March 1965, the Manchester Carriage Company was formed, which brought together a number of horse bus operators in the Manchester area. 1880 would see the Manchester Carriage and Tramways Company make some more consolidation, and they would absorb the Manchester Suburban Tramways Company. On the 7th of June 1901, Manchester Corporation Tramways Department started electric tram operations. In 1906, the company started operating its first motor buses, and to reflect this, in 1929, the name was changed to Manchester Corporation Transport Department. From 1938, the company started using trolley buses to replace trams, and this was completed in 1949, with the last tram route to Stockport being closed that year. In mid-1966, the name of the company was changed to Manchester City Transport, and I'm going to stop there because we've jumped a little bit ahead of ourselves, haven't we? The early years would see a little bit of a mix with the vehicle types operated. There would be Daimlers, AECs, a Carrier, Bristols, and a Vulcan. I'm sorry, I've got to do the joke. It's illogical to mix your vehicles up like that. In the 1930s, the company took Crosleys and Leylands, but from 1940, Daimler chassis started to enter the fleet. But I'm not going to go into all the history of the company because we'll keep that back for a rainy day, shall we? 1958 would see the launch of the Leyland Atlantean, which, you can't argue, was a complete and utter game changer. Whilst it certainly wasn't the first rear-engined bus built, it was fundamentally the most successful. Now, Manchester Corporation Transport was known for their cutting-edge designs and their love of new technology. They were normally one of the first companies of that era to try out new things, and if they liked it, it was adopted and quickly used. And these experiments would result in things like jointly operated services, diesel-engined buses, metal-framed bodywork, and 8-foot wide buses. But probably its greatest achievement was the mass change to one-man operation of double-decker buses. So with all their previous innovations behind them, the city councillors of Manchester were keen for the city to have the latest buses, these obviously being the new all-singing, all-dancing, rear-engined Leyland Atlantean. But there was opposition from the trade unions, and the department's engineering team were also cynical about some of the design on the Atlantean. The one-man operation of double-decker buses became legal in the UK in 1966, and before this, Manchester was chasing the dream of having one-man operated double-decker buses. But with the government not allowing this, obviously there was no hurry to go out and buy vast fleets of Leyland Atlanteans. So thus the 1957 vehicle order went to Leyland for 110 front-engined rear platform Titan PD2s, which this was soon changed after to 100 PD2s and 10 Leyland Atlanteans, and all of these buses would have Metro camel bodies. The idea was for the corporation to try the new model and for councillors to ensure Manchester was up to date. But there was still the problem of the unions and how they would overcome their rejection of these buses. These first Atlanteans were delivered at the end of 1959 and were numbered 3621 to 3630 and were registered UMB 621 to UMB 630. The buses were sent to Northenden Garage, which had a strong union branch. And when they became licensed and used for driver training, they were soon blacked by the union and its members. The corporation took 4 months of negotiations with the unions to get their use, and during this time the Atlanteans were only used for a few engineering runs. Unfortunately, the Manchester Evening News discovered this and ran an article. They wanted to know why these ultra-expensive modern Red Dragons, as they were christened at the time, were not being used. With an agreement finally reached with the unions, and this was for their use only on limited stop services, the Atlanteans entered service in April 1960 on Route 101, which was Piccadilly, Wythenshawe and Newell Green, which only required 5 or 6 buses for the normal day service. Within a few months, the buses would be moved to Parles Wood Garage and put to work on Route 50, which was running from Albert Square to Kingsway to East Didsbury. This wasn't a limited stop service though, and neither overly busy or tightly timed. This route needed 9 buses, and at the time there was a running comment that said plus the one that was always on the pits. But anybody who has seen my previous Atlantean videos will know that these early buses, and not just the Manchester ones, suffered from all sorts of issues. They overheated, there were gearbox problems, and they were very underpowered. And Leyland's guarantee of fuel savings didn't really deliver. And this would escalate into a bit of an argy-bargy with Leyland. And in 1963-1964, the corporation forced Leyland to provide 9 low-priced Power Plus kits for the Atlanteans, as well as a larger 0680 engine for 3621. The corporation's engineers were not overly impressed by the Leyland Atlanteans' close-coupled gearbox and the awkward angled drive to the rear axle. There were issues with the interior layout as well, and this would result in several accidents on the staircases of the buses, and this would lead the corporation to design its own spiral staircase, and this would modify 3629 late in 1960. And the later Atlanteans and Daimler Fleetlines would be specified with this design of staircase. Now, talking of 3629, this had air suspension along with sister bus 3630, and it wasn't properly damped and produced an unpleasant aft and pitching seesaw motion. And again, we've seen this, haven't we? 1960s air suspension did leave an awful lot to be desired. If you've watched my video about the AEC Bridgemaster, that explains all about it there. And again, this air suspension on these Atlanteans was known to make passengers seasick. The buses also had rather uncomfortable small-backed seats, and these were replaced eventually with ones taken out from withdrawn trolley buses. This happening around 1964-1965, and this would be the same time that the air suspension was removed on 3629 and 3630. In 1961, Daimler Fleetline demonstrator 7000 HP came on loan. Here it was placed on the Route 40 alongside the Leyland Atlanteans. Now, the Daimler Fleetline had a separate engine and gearbox which was joined by a small prop shaft, and it also had a drop centre rear axle which allowed a flat lower deck floor and a reduced overall height. But more importantly to Manchester, it also had a Gardner 6LX engine. Now, Gardners were a local company, and like many companies of the time, they were keen to support local industry. And in the corporation's eyes, this put the Daimler ahead of the Atlantean. The next round of vehicle orders were delivered in 1961, and it was a little bit more conventional. There were no rear-engined Atlanteans or Fleetlines for that matter. There were 10 Daimler CVG6s, 5 Leyland Tiger Cub single-decker buses, and 40 more Leyland PD2 Titans. But over the next few years, the orders from Manchester started to give Leyland a little bit of a wake-up call. Although Manchester would take Tiger Cubs and PD2s, it would also take Fleetlines, these being delivered in 1962-1963. And in 1963-1964, there were only 25 Leyland PD2 Titans, whilst there were 25 front-engined Daimlers and 20 more Fleetlines. And it's worth noting that each time that Leyland delivered these buses, they were also delivered late as well, and they still didn't meet the promised fuel consumption figures. These first 40 Fleetlines went straight into service at Northenden, Princes Road and Hyde Road garages on busy all-day duties. Now naturally Daimler was over the moon with these orders from Manchester, and would go on to exhibit Manchester's first Fleetline at the 1962 Commercial Motor Show, fitting it with a big chrome-plated Daimler moustache badge. Meanwhile, the first batch of Atlanteans, 3621 to 3630, had had their engine modifications done, with the Power Plus systems all fitted and the larger engine fitted into one of the buses. These were moved onto Queen's Road in late 1963, where for several years they worked the 121 limited stop service between the city centre and Middleton and the Langley estate. However, this service would only need 6 buses, and the rest of the batch were used on pretty much anything. The feedback that Leyland was getting about its Atlantean obviously must have sunk in after a while, because this would result in the Atlantean PDR1/2 version, which was an improved and updated version of the original Atlantean. Now, one of those changes that these newer Atlanteans had was a drop centre rear axle, which had been made by Albion for its Lowlander. However, because of torque restrictions on the drop axle, it was only offered with the 0600 engine, but Leyland agreed to supply Manchester's buses with the 0680 engine, although that had been derated to 130 brake horsepower. Further batches of Atlanteans and Fleetlines would arrive in 1964, 1965 and 1966, and these would feature a slightly restyled bodywork with a new, fresher moulded front panel and a wraparound curved windscreen. Despite this, though, the basic Metro Camel bodywork would remain the same. In 1964-1965, the bus industry was pressing the government to allow one-man operation of double-deckers, and Manchester was at the forefront of the campaign, led by the general manager at the time, Albert Neal. Manchester was convinced that one-man operation was essential to its future. In fact, it had been running several suburban services with one-man operated buses way back since 1949, and this had started with a front-engined Leyland Tiger that had been converted to normal control, and this was used on the Dane Bank service. 4 underfloor engined Royal Tigers followed, with new services in Didsbury and Wythenshawe. These would be followed by a small batch of Albion Aberdonians and 15 Leyland Tiger Cubs. By 1963, Manchester had 25 single-decker buses that could be used without conductors. The corporation had decided if one-man operation was to be extended, it would mean more single-deckers, but then they would have to be rear-engined, more modern ones, to allow a lower floor area and easier boarding. And again, this is something that we brought up in the video on the Optare Solo, wasn't it? That the low-floor bus actually isn't a new idea. It's a new design, but the idea goes all the way back to the First World War. And here we are in the mid-1960s talking about a bus that required lower access. At the time, there was several choices available to Manchester. There was the Daimler Roadliner, which had only just been announced, but instead of using a Gardner engine, it had a V6 Cummins engine, which they weren't overly keen on that idea. Isn't it strange again how trends have changed? in this day and age where everything is now a Cummins engined bus. Well, pretty much everything. Not everything, but pretty much. You know what I mean. The Leyland Panther was also available, however that was 36 foot long, and Manchester wanted something shorter with a smaller engine, something like the 0400 Leyland engine, which had been used in the Tiger Cub. Manchester managed to persuade Leyland that there would be a good market for it, and the result would be the 33 foot long Leyland Panther Cub. And in 1963 Manchester would order 20 of these off the drawing board, which, to be honest, is never a good idea, is it? These would be bodied by Park Royal and would be delivered in 1965. From the outset, these were designed to be one-man operated, and Leyland would display the first one at the 1964 Motor Show. 10 of these would go to Birchfields Road Garage, and they would convert the Route 97, which ran from Piccadilly to the Yew Tree Hotel, and this would be the first all-day one-man operated service in the city centre. Leyland would also borrow 2 of these buses for demonstration to other customers. Now, because of concerns about performance and their fingers being burnt with the early Atlanteans and their rather lacklustre performance, half of the buses were fitted with turbochargers. Nowadays we take turbocharged diesel engines on buses pretty much for granted. They're everywhere, aren't they? But in the 1960s, this again was really cutting-edge technology, but they did tend to prove rather troublesome and were usually disconnected. Overall, the Panther Cubs weren't overly reliable. They weren't the greatest success, but Manchester really couldn't complain because they had convinced Leyland to build the buses in the first place. As I mentioned earlier, Manchester would go on to buy more Atlanteans and Fleetlines. But just to show how things were changing at that time, in 1963, the orders would call for 20 Panther Cubs, 30 Fleetlines, 30 0680 Atlantean PDR 1/2s, and 50 Leyland PD2 Titans. However, 42 more Leyland Atlanteans would soon be added to that order. The corporation had managed to make more progress with the unions accepting these buses, and these newer PDR 1/2 Leyland Atlanteans went into normal service at Queen's Road, Parlswood, Princess Road, Northenden and Rochdale Road garages. The orders for the 1964-1965 delivery called for 60 Leyland Atlanteans and 60 Fleetlines, and these would be pretty much the same as the previous ones, but with a red rather than green interior. 30 more Panthers would also be ordered, this time with Metro Camel Wayman bodywork. These would be one-man operated and fitted with auto-slot, self-service ticket machines and entry turnstiles. Well, that's a little bit like a DMS, isn't it? And the SMSs and the MBAs and everything like that, the Merlins and the Swifts from London. Now, interestingly, these would introduce another Manchester safety innovation, which was a 6th neutral position on the gear lever, which had to be selected to allow the doors to be opened. And that's very interesting because I never knew that started in Manchester. Both my buses PKE 807M and PKE 809M have this feature, and now I know that it originated in Manchester. The general manager of Manchester, Albert Neal, retired in March 1965, and he was promptly invited to become a special advisor to the Minister of Transport. Now, as we mentioned previously, Albert Neal was one of the prime industry lobbyists for one-man operated buses, and now he had the ear of the minister. Mr. Neal's successor at Manchester was Ralph Bennett, who had come from Bolton, where he'd been general manager there. Now, Ralph Bennett had a track record of innovation in vehicle design and operation and appearance, and if you've ever seen a Bolton Leyland Atlantean, you'll know exactly what I mean. Ralph Bennett knew that labour costs had to be reduced through one-man operated buses, and bus travel had to be made to be much more attractive but cost-effective. In July 1965, tenders were invited for 96 more double-decker buses, and with these changes in mind, the previous month 2 Bolton Leyland Atlanteans were borrowed and were both displayed to passengers and staff, who were then invited to comment on them. Staff member Ken Mortimer then produced sketches of a striking new design which incorporated the feedback that the company had received regarding the Bolton Atlanteans. And in October, the Transport Committee agreed to buy 48 Leyland Atlanteans and 48 Daimler Fleetlines, which had been fitted with Park Royal bodywork to Mortimer's design, which would include a bright new livery and a new fleet name. This fleet name would be Manchester City Transport. The operation of one-man double-decker buses was permitted from the 1st of July 1966. Previously, just before this, there'd been a bit of an interim period where one-man operated double-decker buses were permitted, but the upper deck had to be shut off. That's a bit bizarre, isn't it? Suddenly finding itself able now to operate one-man operated double-decker buses, it realised how good the decision to persevere with the Fleetlines and the Atlanteans had been. But the need for the Leyland Panthers and Panther Cubs vanished pretty much overnight. These being withdrawn rather quickly in the early 70s, and several ending up in Australia along with some of the first of the 10 Leyland Atlanteans, including the sole surviving UMB 629, which is now immaculately restored by the Museum of Transport in Manchester. After it was repatriated some years ago, that was some restoration, wasn't it? The 3rd of August 1966 would see the Transport Committee accept Ralph Bennett's bold plan to convert everything to one-person double-deck operation as quickly as was feasible. And apart from the very first batch of Leyland Atlanteans that arrived, the PDR-1s, the original ones, all other Atlanteans and Fleetlines were subsequently converted to one-man operation. Ken Mortimer's bodywork was destined to become Britain's first purpose-designed one-man operated double-decker bus. This would feature a wide front entrance which would allow 2 parallel streams of boarding passengers with fares paid into auto-slot self-service ticket machines. The bus would be fitted with a wide central exit door to address the main problem of one-man operated buses, and that would be the dwell time at bus stops. If passengers could board and alight simultaneously, it would speed things up. The new design would accommodate 96 passengers with 45 seated upstairs, 28 seated downstairs, plus 23 standing, and this would result in the lower saloon floor being reinforced to carry the extra weight. All this extra weight, though, would cause a problem with the Atlantean PDR 1/2 chassis. It basically couldn't be used because the extra laden weight needed the full power of the 0680 engine, and this would be too much for the Albion axle. So the 48 Atlanteans that they'd ordered had to be the PDR 1A/1 chassis. The Fleetline didn't have this problem, of course. There was also a brief disagreement with Park Royal. Park Royal wanted to use its own body design, however Ralph Bennett quickly quashed that and Park Royal went on to build it to their design. And this design would be called the Mancunian. The first one to arrive would be numbered 1001 and would be registered HVM 901F. Local politics dictated that the first bus would be a Leyland, so this was on a Leyland Atlantean chassis, and the Leyland Motor Corporation chairman and managing director, Sir Donald Stokes, handed 1001 over to the chairman of the Transport Committee at Leyland on the 19th of February 1968. The following Saturday in Manchester Piccadilly there was a public launch, and this would feature 1001 in a red and white livery and 1024 in a red and cream livery, which were both on display and also giving short free rides. Passengers and crews that attended were asked to complete a questionnaire on which livery they preferred, cream or white, and the white was the one that was chosen. There would be 472 Mancunians built and delivered between 1968 and 1972, the last ones being to Selneck PTE, which had taken over from Manchester's bus operations on the 1st of November 1969. Of these, 179 were Leyland Atlanteans, whilst 293 were Fleetlines. This split again being due to issues again with the Leyland Atlantean, although the Fleetline too had its fair share of problems. The majority of the bodywork on the Mancunians was built by Park Royal. Metro Camel Wayman and East Lancs coach builders should have shared the rest. However, there were events that changed this, and Rowe, which was, like Park Royal, a Leyland subsidiary, built the final 34 bodies. There were minor detail differences between the bodies on the buses, and there are probably experts who can tell the difference between who built what, when and where. Over the years, the design of the Mancunian would evolve, with buses being 33 foot long, a higher set driving position, a forward ascending staircase, and some being built with single doors. The adjoining cities of Manchester and Salford were always rivals, and Manchester City councillors and transport department staff were surprised and more than likely flattered when Salford ordered 20 Atlantean Mancunians. It was just simply a case of Salford trying to have buses as modern as Manchester's. However, these were to be operated with conductors, but they were delivered after Selneck took over. Ralph Bennett left Manchester in September 1968 to become effectively the chief executive at London Transport Buses, and took the main features of the Mancunian with him, where it would become the DMS, Daimler Fleetlines. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed that look at the very early stages of one-man operated double-decker buses in Manchester and how they made a total success of it. Especially, say, when compared with, and I'll whisper this, London Transport. One-man operated, or one-person operated buses, as they are now known, is something that, again, we take for granted. But at the time in the 1960s, it was just such a new and novel feature. And there's many people who will say that one-person operated buses was the point where the industry started to take a trajectory downwards turn. And maybe so, but unfortunately things did need to change when it came to making everything cost effective. In an ideal world, it wouldn't be like that, would it? There'd be plenty of subsidies for all sorts of bus services and subsidised travel, and there would be a jolly smiling conductor on every bus helping everybody on with their bags and buggies and such. But unfortunately, that's not the real world, is it? Everything, sadly, is all about money. As I said, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, hype and share it. Now, I know that hypes aren't available on computers or on televisions, but if you're watching it on a device, give us a hype. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel too, so you don't miss my future releases in this and my other series here on sunny YouTube. And if you want to check out my back catalogue, no, that's nothing rude, don't worry. There's going to be all sorts of interesting bus videos on there that will appeal to the bus enthusiast of good taste, just like yourself. If you're enjoying the bus videos and enjoying the channel content, you can always buy me a drink. Just click the super thanks button and follow from there. I would be ever so grateful. Thank you so much in advance. And finally, don't forget to comment down below with your thoughts, memories and recollections on one-person operated buses. Double-decker, single or any. Also the Mancunian, what did you think of it? And what did you think of Ralph Bennett's vision for Manchester? Once again, thanks ever so much for watching. Bye for now.